Right, so now we're going to talk about the loads of E. coli that need to be reduced from the water body to meet water quality standards, and then also we'll provide an overview of the management measures and recommendations that have come out of the working groups, and also get some feedback on what you may think we should add or adjust or anything of that nature to the discussion as well. So I'll present the information on the loads, and then Claire will take over and do the presentation on the management measures. So for estimating the loads, we use a tool called a load duration curve. And what this does is it basically takes into consideration the concentration of E. coli or Enterococcus, depending on where you're working at and what the parameter is, and then does some math to create that into a load based on the flow volume that was present at the time of the sample or on average for that day. So what we did is we calculated load duration curves for the assessment units that had sufficient bacteria data and mean daily flow records. So initially what we did is we used water quality monitoring data that's available in TCEQ's database that's collected either by the Nueces River Authority or the TCEQ regional office. And then we also used the instantaneous stream flow measurements that are collected with those same sample sets. So we initially developed those load duration curves, took a look at them, and they were not that robust. So what we did, and the slide is wrong, it says we're still evaluating this, but we actually did it and took a look at it and determined that this is a way better option. But we actually used the USGS stream gauge data that's available in the watershed. There are actually 2 stream gauges that are out there and actively collecting data now. And we were able to estimate flows at the points in the watershed where the data were collected. So there's a process called a drainage area ratio that USGS has developed, and they've statistically validated it for basically every water body in the state, where you can use a existing USGS gauge as a surrogate for essentially any location out there across the state, as long as they're in close proximity. And obviously with gauges in the watershed, that's good enough for government work, as they like to say. So that's the method we used here, and that's what we're going to be presenting. But before we get to that, I'm going to show you kind of our thought process for whittling down the stations that we're taking a look at. So this is the map we showed earlier that shows the sampling stations that have been evaluated recently. And for San Fernando, obviously the choice was pretty easy. There's only one station that has E. coli data collected routinely on it and flow data. So that made our choice easy there. On Petronila, it's a little bit different scenario. There's actually 3 data collection stations highlighted there that have a significant amount of E. coli and or Enterococcus data, depending on which one they are. So the most downstream station is usually what we try to use for load duration curves, because that allows us to essentially evaluate everything that's going on upstream in the watershed and determine what management recommendations make a lot of sense for that to address those issues. It's not always possible though, and it's not always the best approach. And in this case, we essentially found that that was true. And one of the issues is that downstream station, that 13090 that's listed there, is actually a tidal station. So it's one of those where there's no flow data collected. The tides influence the water movement, so some days the water may be moving upstream, some days it may be moving downstream, or it may just be sitting there doing nothing. So it's not feasible to collect a flow measurement at those locations. There is a computer-based model that can be used. It's called a modified load duration curve that basically allows you to estimate what the flow rates would be at that point. It's not as robust as a traditional load duration curve, and given the fact that it's not really going to change the outcomes for what management gets prescribed in the watershed protection plan, we determined that using that station 13096 would make a lot more sense and be a much more direct route to get to the point. Other thing is that if you look at the concentrations that reported to by the state in their annual water body assessments, every other year water body assessment, the difference between the recent geometric mean and the water quality standard is much greater at that station 13096. So basically what that says is that there's a larger needed load reduction at that location than there would be at the downstream location. So it's essentially taking the conservative approach and saying, okay, we're going to address the biggest issue, and in turn we'll also take care of that other one downstream as well. So that's the thought process behind selecting these two stations, and it certainly makes I guess quantifying needed management easier whenever you have one target to shoot at as opposed to two. So with that, I'm going to switch over and demonstrate these load duration curves. So this is a load duration curve with some highlights and arrows and things circled just to help better understand these things. So this is for San Fernando Creek, so it's at station just north of Kingsville there on 77. And you'll notice that the data period is from 1990 all the way up to 2021. So there's not actually E. coli data collected that far back. It was actually the early 2000s when E. coli started being collected. But there was a good data record and good flow data going back that far. So we were able to integrate flow information from that far back into this load duration curve to basically illustrate the range of flow conditions that you might see. Obviously, those water bodies in the watershed can certainly move a lot of water, but that's fairly infrequent, and that's not necessarily caught in the instantaneous sample collection that either the Nueces River Authority or TCEQ does. It is sometimes, but it's not common. It's more common for them to be out there on normal flow condition days or even low flow condition days, because those storm events and high flows, again, don't occur that often, and they also present some I guess safety challenges to navigate as well. But by using that USGS data, we get a better idea of what the range of flows is, so we can really superimpose our water quality data on top of those flow ranges to see how it stacks up under those high flow conditions compared to the low flow conditions. So what we have presented is the open circles are actually the concentration data multiplied out by some conversion factors to get it from a colony forming units of bacteria per 100 milliliters of water up to a volume of E. coli over the course of the day. So your flow volumes are recorded in cubic feet per second, and we can do some math to multiply out the number of seconds per day, the number of milliliters in a cubic foot of water, and things like that to get a volume of E. coli. So what you get there are some really large numbers of E. coli presented. So you'll see the y-axis, this is in billions of E. coli per year. So we actually even multiply it out by 365 days to see what that equates to from a load perspective. So those are actually loading values that you see there. The black solid line that kind of squiggles across from left to right, that's the water quality standard multiplied out by those same flow values. So that's our target. What we would like to see is most of those open circle values be below that line. That means they're within the water quality standard and meeting water quality. Obviously, you can tell pretty quickly that most of the values are not below the line. In fact, they're above the line. So that's indicative of needing to reduce E. coli to meet that water quality standard. So from a load target perspective, what we do is we aggregate the values by flow category. So just given the, I guess, the nature of the streams down here, we divided these into 3 different flow categories. We've got high flows, we got mid-range flows, they're in the middle, and then low flows on the right-hand side. And what we do is we take the average geometric mean of these flow volumes, or I'm sorry, E. coli loads within that flow category, and then compute the difference between that average flow volume and the water quality standard. So the average load volume is represented by the little red boxes with the crosshairs in them. So it's essentially what we're looking at from a load reduction perspective is the distance between that box with the crosshair down to the black line. And that is our needed load reduction to meet that water quality standard. So pretty consistent across the board here with San Fernando Creek. There's not a lot of variation. It's not showing that we're way high above the water quality standard under high flow events and then below it under low flow or anything like that. And that's common in some water bodies, but it also helps us understand what types of sources are actually contributing. And I'll have a slide here in just a second that explains that a little bit more. So anyways, that's the San Fernando Creek load duration curve. The next one is the Petronila Creek load duration curve. And again, this is at station 13096 that's kind of there in the middle of the water body. Again, we did the same process. We calculated the loads of E. coli using that concentration and the flow data estimated from the USGS gauge, and then plotted them together and came up with a needed load reduction per flow category. So again, fairly consistent across the board. You do see maybe a little bit bigger gap between the existing loads and the target load, so probably a little bit bigger load reduction needed to meet that water quality standard here, but again, it's generally consistent across the board, and basically indicates that there are issues with E. coli loads exceeding that standard at all flow conditions, so not just under one or the other. So from a general perspective, what these load duration curves tell you is that under high flow conditions, whenever it's either a storm flow event or it's really close proximity to a storm flow event where there's actually been runoff occurring and water running into the streams, you have things that are influencing water quality that are carried by that stormwater. So obviously stormwater runoff from the cities, from the agricultural areas, from the open spaces that are out there. All of that water picks up whatever it comes into contact with and carries it downstream. Most of the times that's sediment and attached things like phosphorus, E. coli. Both of those love to attach to sediment particles, but it can be trash, and in extreme cases it can even be cars and stuff like that. So it could be a lot of different things that are transported under those high flow conditions. Sanitary sewer overflows often occur during these times as well, due for multiple reasons. Could be aging infrastructure that maybe has cracks or broken connections here and there, so it allows stormwater into the sanitary sewer system. It gets in there and it could either overwhelm the treatment plant or just start bubbling out in other locations, and leading to influences on that in-stream water quality. I've even heard of people opening up a clean out in their yard or something like that to the sewer system to drain floodwater out of their yard, and that can certainly overwhelm a system. So not advisable at all, and that's actually something that you should not do because it creates other issues down the line. Failing septic systems also are a driver of water quality under these high flow conditions. Failing septic systems often create like pools of water or things like that in low-lying areas, and if it's not raining, maybe, yeah, it's an issue at the local level, but it's not moving downstream or down the hill or anything like that. But under a big rain event, that runoff can certainly intermingle with that pooled water and move it on down the line, and have it influence that in-stream water quality. On the other end of the spectrum, when it's been dry, hadn't rained in quite a while, or maybe even during a wicked drought like 2011, it's more so the items that have a direct impact on in-stream water quality that are the problem. So obviously you're not having runoff from the landscape carry anything into the water body. So in those cases, it's like failing septic systems again can influence water quality, but in this situation it's more so those that are close to the water body. So Ines mentioned earlier that we evaluated how many septic systems were within 50 and 100 yards of their creek, I believe it was, and those are the ones that can certainly have more of an influence then, because there's less distance for that untreated wastewater to make its way into the creek. Whereas if you have a septic system that's 5 miles from the water body, or even further in some cases, there's less of a chance for that water to actually make it into the creek. Other things that certainly can have influences under these dry and low flow conditions are direct deposition of fecal matter or other contaminants into the water body. So this could be animals doing their business directly into the water or right adjacent to it. Wildlife, for instance, they rely on natural sources of water for their drinking water. Oftentimes that's where the good habitat is that they like to eat and also hang out in for cover. So they spend a lot of time down there near the water bodies. And obviously the amount of time they spend there directly relates to the amount of business they do there and the influences it may have on water quality. Brian mentioned alternative drinking water sources earlier in his presentation, and that's one way to manage some of the time spent near those water bodies. So that's especially true for livestock. Sometimes wildlife may use it as well, and it'll reduce that amount of time and that amount of fecal matter that they deposit either directly into the water body or close by it. Illegal dumping is another issue. It's an issue all the time, but if stuff that contains E. coli gets dumped directly into the water body, it's going to have more of an impact on water quality during these low to no flow conditions. There's always that saying that dilution is the solution to pollution, and if it's not raining, not having any additional water come into the water body, any of those contaminants that are there are going to have a more significant impact on that pollution concentration during those times. So this is when illegal dumping really kind of weighs more heavily on water quality. It obviously does during higher flow conditions, but just not quite to the same level as it does during no flow or low flow conditions. And then lastly is point sources. So these are the sources of contaminant that directly are discharged into the stream. So in a lot of cases, this could be wastewater treatment plants, industrial discharges, stormwater outfalls, things like that. That are permitted, so they are legal to have them there. And when those plants and systems are working properly, in theory, they're not having adverse effects on water quality. We know, of course, that things happen, and these systems sometimes have failures and aren't necessarily performing as planned. So those can certainly have some impacts on in-stream water quality over time, because they are dumping or discharging directly into that water body. So obviously, if it's not been raining and there's no new water coming into the system, that can be a hot spot, if you want to call it that, of either nutrients or E. coli coming into a water body from those point sources. So that's the general thing that load duration curves can tell us. So if our needed load reductions are highest under that high flow category, that tells us that the non-point sources may be a bigger problematic source type than the point sources. Inversely, if our highest load reduction needs are on the low flow side of things, that tells us that it's more so the things that are directly influencing water quality, like the point sources, like the direct depositions, and potentially the failing septic systems that are very nearby the water body. So that's the general utility of these load duration curves, aside from giving us a numeric target to actually strive to achieve with our management recommendations. So speaking of those numeric targets, the next couple of tables that I'm going to present actually show what that value is. So there's a lot of numbers here, and you don't necessarily need to digest all of them and understand them all. Really, the row that's highlighted in the green box down there, that shows the total annual load reduction needed, and that's in billions of E. coli per year. So it's a huge number. That's what 3.9 trillion actually is what this one equates to, since it's 3,983 billion. So that's a really big number. But that said, it's not as big as I've seen in a number of other watersheds, and it's actually quite manageable whenever it comes to recommending management strategies to achieve that goal. So if you look a couple rows above that, you see the percent reduction needed, and these are in the 50s and up to 66. Again, that sounds like a lot, but it's very reasonable compared to some of the other watersheds I've worked in over the years. I've seen some that are in the 95+% load reduction needed. When you see a number like that, that's really pretty staggering. You're like, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to get that much E. coli out of the water body to meet that water quality standard? But this one's very achievable. And just, again, looking at the concentrations that are out there in those water bodies, they're within reason, you know, so it's not a staggering number that we're looking to deal with. But anyways, the numeric target is that 3.9 trillion E. coli per year reduction that we need to theoretically meet that water quality standard. So what we'll do through the management recommendations is use literature values and data that's been published on those E. coli reductions that can be realized through those practices, and basically do the math to estimate what kind of load reductions that we'll see from those practices. And the goal to be obviously meet or exceed this level of load reduction out there across the watershed. So one thing to remember though is that things that you do on the landscape don't necessarily translate to E. coli reductions in stream. So in developing these watershed plans, we often will go well above and beyond this load reduction target, just so we can have a level of cushion in there, if you will, to actually meet that water quality standard down the line. So again, San Fernando Creek, the needed level of load reduction is 3.9 trillion E. coli, but again, also a very reasonable number to reduce. So in Petronila, this is, again, same table, same types of numbers that we're looking at. Obviously, the numbers are a little bit different. The needed level of load reduction is a little bit higher here, but again, if you look at the water quality data, it makes sense. The concentration of E. coli is higher in Petronila Creek per TCEQ's assessments than it is in San Fernando. So it makes sense. If you have more E. coli, you're obviously going to have to remove more of them to meet that water quality standard. So in the case of Petronila, it's 5.9 trillion E. coli per year that need to be reduced. And you'll see the percentages in that 2 rows above are a little bit higher, but still not staggering. The low flow condition is 88.5%, so that's pretty substantial, but again, it's not that terrible. There's actually some hope to achieve that goal over time, and there's certainly some possibilities to address those issues, especially if we can get some of maybe the key sources out there dealt with through this watershed protection plan. So anyways, that's the target, and that's what we're actually going to be shooting for through the management recommendations. And I will switch over to Claire right now, and she's going to talk about the management recommendations that have come out of the work groups. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. One more slide. So this is just a summary of what the load reduction curves, or those LDCs, actually mean, and what they tell us. So it basically tells us that throughout the duration of the year, Petronila and San Fernando Creeks are above that water quality standard. I mean, obviously there are instances where the concentrations are below that, but on average, across the year and across all the flow conditions, those concentrations and those loads are above the allowable amount. So the LDCs, they do indicate that it's a diverse set of sources. So it's not just point sources, or it's not just non-point sources. It's actually everything that's out there. So again, everything with hair, fur, and feathers that's contributing to the E. coli loading in the watershed is actually causing those loads to be higher than that allowable level. And what that translates into is the need for a diverse set of solutions to address these issues. So again, it's not going to be just dealing with wildlife, or just dealing with livestock, or just dealing with wastewater. It's going to be some of all the things. And there's a lot of good work that's already going on out there, already being done across the watershed. But there's certainly more that we can do. So at the end of the day, it's our job as the stewards of the resources that we have to steward, to actually try to do better than we maybe did yesterday. So I always like to think of it as I'm working to protect these resources and improve these resources for my kids and my grandkids one of these days, whenever I have those. So with that in mind, I'll switch over to Claire now, finally, and let her talk about the management recommendations that have come about through the working group discussions, and that we're proposing to include in the watershed protection plan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Escamilla with the Texas Water Resources Institute. Just like Lucas said, I'm going to be talking to y'all about some of the potential management measures that we discussed at our work group meetings that we held this past spring. We had ag and habitat, urban stormwater, septic systems, wastewater treatment facilities, and a science and monitoring group. So we had stakeholders with expertise and knowledge in those areas meet with us and talk to us about potential sources of pollution and areas where there might be needs for some implementation or support to help reduce any potential loadings that are in the watershed. Just as Lucas said before, In order to improve the water quality and reduce bacteria and nutrients in Petronila and San Fernando, we're going to need a variety of solutions looking at all the different potential sources of pollution. So when we think about the management measures, we really want to make sure that we are addressing all of the potential sources of pollution. So some of the examples of what we talked about at our work group meetings were for livestock and agriculture. Really, it's promoting, developing, and implementing those conservation plans or water quality management plans with landowners. So what Brian spoke about in the presentation before this, about finding those landowners who want that technical assistance and maybe some financial assistance to help improve practices on their land to meet their goals, but also help improve water quality. And a lot of this, as well as most of our management measures that we discuss, education and outreach is a big component, is really just making sure people in the watershed know about the water quality in the area, know what could be potential sources of pollution and what they can do to prevent it. For wild pigs, feral hogs, that can also be a contributor of bacteria. The management measures we discussed were about providing technical support with landowners who might be having issues with wild pigs on their property, how to properly trap and maintain, kind of reduce some of those populations. So really try to promote removal of wild pigs, as well as that education and outreach. So giving them the tools they need to help manage and help reduce some of those populations. In our urban areas, as Ennis spoke about before, dogs and cats can be a big contributor just because there's a high population of those dogs and cats, and unfortunately there are many owners who don't pick up after their pets or properly dispose of pet waste. So when we have that high density of pets and if there's not a lot being disposed properly, that can be a source of pollution. So some of the strategies we talked about with our urban work group on how to address this is looking at seeing if within our parks we can maintain and expand any pet waste stations for those stray animals that might be in the area, maintaining and promoting spay and neuter programs to help try to reduce some of those populations, because obviously those stray dogs and cats, nobody's picking up after them as well. And just again, that education and outreach, having that signage, letting people know that they need to dispose of the waste properly. It can end up in our waterways and carry bacteria and other harmful bacteria for us. Illegal dumping was something that came up in almost all of our work groups. That it's a big issue throughout the watershed at many bridges and road crossings, and something that we need to address. There's not always a perfect solution, but some ways that we've dealt with this in the past is looking at hosting watershed cleanup events, so actually kind of being able to clean up some of these illegal dump sites. Just as Lucas and others have said before, trash begets trash. So if people see that there's a lot dumped there, they're not going to feel as bad dumping. So if we can kind of clean up those areas, maybe that will be a deterrent for some of those people dumping. As well, to host household and hazardous waste collection events to increase those frequencies in the watershed, to make it easier and more accessible for people to be able to dispose of those products in the right way, in a safe way. For urban stormwater runoff, we don't have a lot of urban areas here in the watershed. We're mostly rural, but some of the big things that we wanted to address in our urban areas was kind of increasing the development of green stormwater infrastructure and restoration projects for some of the streams that run through these city centers, as well with all of the migratory birds, maybe having trash bin covers so that it reduces some of those birds that are hanging out a lot in those areas, and that also can then take the trash out and further litter throughout the area. As well as, again, that proper education and outreach, making sure that people are being respectful on the property. For septic systems, the big thing is developing repair and replacement programs. We know that there's a good probability that there are some septic systems that are failing or not being properly maintained. So helping to find some financial assistance for those folks that need to repair or replace their septic system, and also provide that education and outreach to homeowners who have septic so that they know when to drain their septic, how to properly maintain it, what to put down as septic, what not, to make sure that it's going to be functioning properly and not going to be accidentally dumping raw sewage into your watershed. So for some of these management measures, we can actually kind of estimate, come up with an idea of how the potential loading that we're expecting to reduce based on how much we implement. And we're able to get these numbers through looking at past literature and research from past plans and demonstration site studies. So with Lucas's presentation, when he was talking about the loading in the watershed and how much we need to reduce to be able to be below that allowable load limit, this is a good way for us to estimate, are our management measures going to be successful? So I'm going to present kind of what we talked about at our specific work groups on what would be manageable goals for us and then the potential loadings we can expect to see. So for the first one, with that developing conservation plans or water quality management plans with landowners, we asked, a lot of these watershed protection plans, we look on a 10-year time scale. So over 10 years, how many conservation plans or water quality management plans can we implement? And what was discussed at the meeting is we looked at some of the past conservation plans that had been completed in the watershed, and it looked like within the past 2 or 3 years that usually there were around 10 to 13 conservation plans done each year. So we anticipate with this protection plan, hiring a technician, kind of that added support, that added boost in the community and knowledge about this program, that we can probably increase to around 20 plans per year. So if we think 20 plans per year for 10 years, we're thinking we can implement around 200 conservation plans, water quality management plans for San Fernando and 200 for Petronila. And I'll just remind y'all, so as Lucas mentioned in his presentation with loadings, there were different loadings for load reductions needed for San Fernando as well as for Petronila. So even though for this watershed protection plan, we are addressing both watersheds, for these management measures, we are kind of looking, specific San Fernando watershed, Petronila watershed, because their load reductions needed are different. For the technical assistance to be able to promote the removal of wild pigs, we're hoping that we can help reduce some of that wild pig population within the watershed. So we wanted to try to think of what could be a manageable percent reduction that we could see annually. So you'll see on the left is kind of the estimate of feral hogs in Petronila, and the right is in San Fernando. So there are more pigs in San Fernando than there are in Petronila, so that's why those 5, 10, 15% numbers are different. And the potential loadings that we can expect to see are different just because there are more in San Fernando. And so what we asked for our ag habitat work group was, what did we think was a reasonable goal? And they felt that 15% for both watersheds that we could work to help reduce those populations did seem like something that could be manageable. So that's what we'll put into the plan. For repair and replacements of septic systems, we are estimating that there's about 9,000 of these septic systems in the watershed, and just based on soils, we estimate about a 15% failure rate. So that's around 1,300 OSSFs that we're estimating need repair. So we want to figure out, we would love to be able to replace all those 1,300, but that's expensive, time consuming, as well as, being able to identify how many there really are can be difficult. So we want, a goal for the next 10 years that we feel is attainable. So within our septic system work group, we asked, within the next 10 years, what can we reasonably think that we could repair and replace in the watershed? So again, we kind of looked historically at what has been done. So the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, their non-point source program, does fund repair and replacement programs. And they say typically what they see in a 3-year grant period is repairing and replacing 15 septics. So if we think about that out to 9 years, that'd be around 45 septic systems. And then we do anticipate that there is additional funding that's available for repair and replacements from USDA as well as GLO. So again, with that added support and with the plan kind of helping prioritize this area, we think we can get a little bit above that. So we're thinking 100 septic systems within the whole watershed, with 60 in San Fernando and 40 in Petronila, kind of as our goal to be able to try to start to repair and replace these septic systems. For maintaining and expanding pet waste stations, we wanted to be able to again see what was already out there in our parks, in the communities, as well as the needs. So it's estimated that there's around 20,000 dogs in the watershed. Just based on past literature, about 40% of owners don't pick up after their pets, and around 20% we think is people who are actually willing to change their behavior if they're given the proper tools or the proper, make it easy for them. So we wanted to see what we felt was a reasonable goal for percentage of those 40% that don't pick up after their pets, on who that we might be able to influence a behavior change. So again, San Fernando has more households, so it has a much larger number of dog estimates, why there's a larger load reductions expected in that watershed than Petronila. So one question that came up in our work groups was, well, we want to know how many parks are out there and how many actually have pet waste stations. So I have that information on the next slide. This shows all of the city and county parks in the watershed. So there's around 27 parks. From the meeting that we had, we learned that probably around 25% have pet waste stations, but maintenance of them in the long term can be an issue, where they're set up, but obviously people are not checking on them or cleaning them as frequently as they should be. So that's something that we'll want to look at and address within our watershed protection plan. Another strategy that was discussed was including those little waste bags that you can carry with you, that has a carabiner that you can clip onto your leash or onto your belt loop to be able to carry with you. And maybe something like that might be a little bit more palatable in this area, since there's less demands from city staff for maintenance. It's something that the owner can carry with them and pick up, and again, that convenience can help encourage that behavior change. So with that, we're trying to be on the more conservative side, and we're thinking that maybe we can influence around a 15% of owners that don't pick up after their pet by including some of these strategies in the watershed protection plan, and then bring in that education and outreach and make it easy for them to pick up after their pets. Other management measures, it's hard to estimate total loads just because it's going to really vary based on what is actually brought into the watershed. But other things that we are targeting and we are going to be putting into the plan. So as I mentioned, that illegal dumping, even though we can't estimate water quality improvements from it, we know it's a big concern, tires especially. So we are going to make sure we put in some language on how we are going to address that through signage, through those cleanup events, proper disposal of hazardous waste. So we'll make sure that that is in the watershed protection plan. Again, wildlife is something, because it's so variable and so hard to estimate populations within a watershed, it's not something that is easy to put in a management measure or estimate its improvements, but we do know that it's a contributor of bacteria. So wildlife is mentioned as a potential source because we know it is. Outreach to septic system homeowners and colonias. We know that that's really important. We know that there are some colonias in the areas. We've spoken to several folks that do outreach in the colonias, and they've mentioned, we really need to bring the information to them. It's unlikely that they'll come to one of these meetings, so bringing handouts and flyers to food drives and local events in the area are key, as well as maintaining those relationships with those folks that do work with the colonias is going to be really important for us, so that we can reach out to them and make sure that we're keeping them updated on some of these water quality goals and concerns. For urban stormwater management, we're going to put in talking about green stormwater infrastructure. There's some constructed wetlands that are in discussion in the watershed, as well as restoration projects. So because the actual load reductions that we'll see vary based on the size, location, actual system that is set up, again, it's really hard to estimate, but it's something that is needed in the watershed and we'll include in the plan. For wastewater treatment facilities, we've been very fortunate to talk with the Nueces River Authority, who have been doing a lot of great work with the local wastewater treatment facilities in the area. They're actually taking over ownership of several of them as funding becomes available to help update a lot of their infrastructure, as well as to bring in some of their personnel to help with the maintenance and running of those facilities. And so they're going to look at continuing to expand on that and work with more facilities, with a long-term goal of maybe being able to have a regional facility instead of just these smaller ones, and help have a larger funding source so that they can support these improvements in the long run. Also developing sanitary sewer overflow initiatives, so things that can be implemented at their facilities to help reduce the risk of overflows during large rain events or large events where there might be, excuse me, risk for overflows. Also, a big thing that was discussed that we'll be including in the plan is education and outreach, not only for the plant operators, but also for homeowners. Just understanding what is allowed to be dumped down a drain, so making sure that there's proper disposal of their fats, oils, and greases. And what has been brought up to us, especially during now with COVID and a lot of people using a lot of sanitary wipes, is they're just flushing those down their toilets, and that's causing a lot of backup and a lot of issues at these treatment facilities. So we want to make sure that we reach these homeowners so that they know what they can and can't dump down their drains, flush down their toilets, so that it's not creating issues at the facility and not allowing them to be able to work appropriately. So what that will look like is developing one-pagers or handouts, and something that we can look at mailing out to homeowners, either including it with their water bill or something we do separately with the plan, but just making sure we get that word out. So in the next steps and the near term, for those of you listening on the recording, so on our webpage, you'll see that there's our draft first 3 chapters of the Watershed Protection Plan. So that's what you learned about in that first presentation earlier with Ennis and Lucas. Feel free to read through that, and please send me edits by September 15th. This is a stakeholder-driven process. We really want to make sure that we're getting input from stakeholders through all steps of the process in developing this plan. So we really appreciate hearing what y'all think. And we will make sure that we address any concerns. So if anything came up during any of these presentations that you want more information on or clarification on, definitely email us, and we'd be happy to work with you on that or discuss more. As y'all are working on that, we're going to start drafting the next several chapters. So that's going to include some of those watershed population estimates with cattle, deer, hogs that Ennis presented in that first presentation, as well as some of these management measures that we just discussed now, which turn out to be chapters 4, 5, and 6 of the Watershed Protection Plan. So we'll be working on the next 3 chapters to present at our next stakeholder meeting. Our next stakeholder meeting, we're looking at early November. We're hoping that it's going to be in person again. It seems like Bishop was a good location for the folks that showed up, but if you are interested or you'd like to attend but have trouble making it to that location, let me know. And we've also discussed looking at places in Kingsville, so we're open to suggestions on time and location to make sure that we're meeting in the best spot that we can get as many folks to attend who want to attend. So with that, I want to thank y'all for listening to this recording of our presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please email myself, Lucas, or Ennis, and we will work with y'all to get you an answer. And I appreciate y'all's time. Take care. Bye.